The scream cut through the metal corridors like a rusted blade. Grak pressed his massive green fist against the corrugated iron bars. The smell of rotting fungus and motor oil filled his nostrils. Behind him, 40 other orcs, crammed into a space meant for 10. The feeding pit lay 20 feet below. Something moved in the darkness down there. Something that used to be an orc. "Fresh meat," bellowed the warden, his cybernetic eye glowing red in the dim light. The mechanical arm extending from his back grabbed another prisoner. "Time for your rehabilitation." The bars groaned under Grak's grip. Iron flakes fell like snow. This wasn't just punishment. This was entertainment. The warden's laugh echoed off concrete walls stained with decades of blood. Steam hissed from broken pipes overhead. The temperature never dropped below scorching. "Please, boss," whimpered the selected orc, his voice cracking like brittle bone. "I only stole one bolt. One bolt. In human prisons, that might earn you kitchen duty. Here, it earned you the pit." The prisoner's claws scraped against the floor as he was dragged forward. Other inmates pressed against their cell doors, green faces twisted with a mixture of terror and anticipation. Some crimes deserved punishment. Some punishments deserved an audience. The warden paused at the edge of the feeding pit. His metal fingers drummed against the railing with mechanical precision. Tap, tap, tap. "You know the rules, boys," he announced to the watching cells. "Survive 3 days. You earn your freedom." Grak had been here 6 months. He'd never seen anyone climb back out. The prisoner looked down into the abyss. His breathing came in short, panicked bursts. The stench rising from below made even hardened orc warriors gag. "What's down there?" the prisoner whispered. The warden's grin revealed teeth filed to sharp points. "Your cellmates." The push was gentle, almost tender. The fall lasted 3 seconds. The screaming lasted much longer. Grak watched the darkness swallow another soul. The feeding pit had rules. The feeding pit had appetites. But what lurked in those depths wasn't the real horror of orc prison. The real horror was how quickly you started hoping someone else would fall next. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. Across 1,000,000 worlds, the Imperium of Man fights for survival against Xenos horrors that would make demons weep. But among all the nightmares that crawl through the void, none are more brutal than the orcs. These green-skinned savages don't just kill their enemies. They collect them. For 40,000 years, Imperial soldiers have whispered stories around dying campfires. Stories of comrades who vanished in the smoke of battle, only to be dragged away screaming into orc warships. Stories of prison camps where the very concept of mercy doesn't exist. What the orcs call keeping the good uns alive becomes something far darker than death. Their prison systems aren't built on rehabilitation or justice. They're built on entertainment, on spectacle, on the simple, savage joy of watching something break. Every captured Imperial guardsman becomes a plaything in a cosmic joke where the punchline is always pain. Every space marine stripped of his armor becomes proof that even the Emperor's finest can be reduced to meat. The stench of fear mingles with engine oil and spilled blood as transport ships lumber through the warp, their holds packed with human cargo. The temperature drops as hope dies, degree by degree, breath by breath. But this isn't just alien cruelty. It's systematic, organized. The orcs have turned suffering into an art form, and their prisons are the galleries where they display their masterpieces. In our world, we debate prison reform and human rights. We argue about justice and rehabilitation. But in the 41st millennium, those concepts are as dead as the worlds the orcs have stripped bare. What emerges from Ork prison camps aren't survivors. They're warnings, living testaments to what happens when civilization meets its opposite. The irony cuts deeper than any blade. Humanity's greatest warriors, bred for war and hardened by 1,000 battles, discover that nothing prepared them for this. Not the training, not the conditioning, not even their faith in the God Emperor. Because the Orks understand something that civilized species refuse to accept. That breaking a person isn't about the body. It's about the moment they realize no one is coming to save them. But how do these warriors of the Imperium end up in Ork hands in the first place? The answer reveals a truth more terrifying than the prisons themselves. In the fetid darkness of Ork prison warrens, power doesn't flow from guards or wardens. It bleeds from fang and claw. The stench of rotting meat mingles with the acrid smoke of makeshift forges. Here, in chambers carved from asteroid rock and starship hulls, the strongest Orks don't just survive. They rule. At the apex sits the war boss, not the prison's original leader, but whoever ripped his throat out last Tuesday. Boss Scarfang surveys his domain from a throne of welded scrap and enemy skulls. His scarred hide bears the testament of 100 challenges. The temperature drops as lesser Orks shuffle past, their heads bowed in submission. But submission in Ork culture is temporary. Below him, the knobs prowl the cell blocks like predators. Each commands their own gang of boys, extracting tribute in teeth, scrap metal, and fresh meat. The sound of grinding metal echoes through the corridors as they sharpen their weapons, waiting. The boys themselves huddle in groups, their green skin glistening with nervous sweat. They know the rules. Fight or die, lead or follow, eat or be eaten. The weak become currency. The strong become targets. But there's something else moving in these shadows. The Gretchen, smaller, weaker cousins of the Orks, scurry between the giants' legs like living tools. They carry messages, steal scraps, and whisper secrets. They're beady red. Eyes see everything, including what the knobs don't want seen. In cell block Zulu, a young Ork named Grok watches the hierarchy with calculating eyes. His muscles haven't yet swollen to full size, but his mind works differently. He sees patterns where others see chaos. The Gretchen bring him information. Which knob beats his boys too hard, which boss hoards the best weapons, which challenger is planning their move. Grok understands something the others don't. In Ork prison, the hierarchy isn't just about strength, it's about timing. The air grows thick with anticipation as evening feeding approaches. Scarfang's lieutenant, a massive knob called Ironjaw, flexes his cybernetic arm. The metal gleams under the flickering emergency lights. But Ironjaw doesn't see the Gretchen slipping poison fungus into his gruel. He doesn't notice Grok's subtle hand signals. The hierarchy is about to shift, and in Ork prison, when power changes hands, it never happens quietly. But what Grok didn't know was that someone else had been watching him. The arena floor steams with yesterday's carnage. Fresh sand cannot mask the copper stench that clings to every breath. Grok the Scar-bearer stands in the holding pit, his massive green fists wrapped in crude iron knuckles. Around him, 40 other prisoners wait their turn. The Ork prison system operates on a brutal simplicity. Every dawn brings the same ritual. Guards drag inmates from their cells and sort them like livestock. The weak become spectators. The strong become entertainment. The smart become dead. Wah! The crowd's roar shakes dust from the ceiling as two Orks tear into each other above. Blood spatters the cheering masses who lean forward, desperate for violence. Grok watches a fellow prisoner's skull crack against the arena wall. The victor raises his arms, basking in the thunderous approval. But victory means nothing here. The gladiatorial system serves a darker purpose than mere entertainment. Each fight generates currency. Teeth knocked loose become betting chips. Broken bones heal stronger. Survivors earn extra rations. The war boss who runs this facility understands orc psychology perfectly. Violence doesn't punish orcs. It feeds them. So he's created something worse than punishment. He's created hope. Every morning, prisoners believe today might be different. Today they might prove themselves worthy. Today they might earn respect, food, maybe even freedom. They're always wrong. Grok has fought 17 times in 3 months. His record stands at 16 wins, 0 losses. The 17th fight never happened. His opponent died of infection before entering the ring. The crowd loves him now. They chant his name between matches. But Grok knows the truth that keeps him awake in his cell. The arena isn't designed to create champions. It's designed to consume them. Every fighter who rises too high gets matched against impossible odds. Fresh meat from other prisons, cybernetic-enhanced killers, sometimes even captured space. Marines, the house always wins. The gate creaks open. A guard points directly at Grok. "You're up, Scar-bearer." Grok steps toward the tunnel leading to the arena floor. The crowd's bloodthirsty roar grows louder with each step. He's fought orcs, humans, even a Tau once. But as he emerges into the blinding arena lights, Grok sees his opponent for the first time. It's not another prisoner. It's something that should never have been captured alive. In the fetid darkness of orc prison camps, power isn't inherited. It's torn from the bleeding hands of the weak. Groknak the Skull Splitter learned this truth when he was nothing more than another broken prisoner, chained to the rust-stained walls of Block 7. The stench of decay and fear hung thick in the recycled air. Metal groaned under the weight of countless bodies pressed into spaces meant for half their number. But Groknak watched. And he waited. The current warden, Boss Scarfang, ruled through simple brutality. Every morning, he would select 3 prisoners for discipline. The sound of bone-meeting metal echoed through the corridors like a twisted alarm clock. Blood pooled in the drainage grates, attracting the scavenger rats that had grown fat on prisoner flesh. Groknak noticed something the others missed. Scarfang was getting slow. The old warden's reflexes had dulled after years of easy dominance. His massive frame, once intimidating, now moved with the sluggish confidence of unchallenged authority. The younger orcs in the guard detail whispered when they thought no one was listening. Opportunity tasted like copper and smelled like spilled oil. On the day of the great feeding, when prisoners fought over scraps of rotting meat thrown into the central pit, Groknak made his move. He didn't challenge Scarfang directly. That would have been suicide. Instead, he whispered poison into eager ears. "Boss is weak," he growled to Grimjaw, Scarfang's most trusted lieutenant. "Look how his hand shakes when he raises the pain stick." The seed took root in fertile ground. Within hours, doubt spread through the guard ranks like a plague. Whispered conversations in dark corners, meaningful glances exchanged during shift changes. The hierarchy that seemed unshakable began to crack. Scarfang sensed the shift too late. When he entered the main cell block that evening, the usual cowering silence was replaced by something far more dangerous. The prisoners still pressed against the walls, but their eyes held a different quality. They were watching. Waiting. Grimjaw stepped forward, his massive fist already clenched around a sharpened piece of scrap metal. "Time for new leadership, boss. The fight lasted exactly 17 seconds. Scarfang's body hit the floor with a wet thud that echoed through every cell. Blood spread in dark rivulets between the metal grating. The smell of death mixed with the ever-present stench of unwashed bodies and industrial waste. Groknak smiled from his cell. Phase 1 was complete, but becoming warden required more than orchestrating a murder. It required proving you could be even more brutal than your predecessor, and Groknak had plans that would make Scarfang's reign look merciful. The real horror hadn't even begun. The screaming starts at dawn. In the sprawling prison camps of Ork-controlled worlds, human captives learn that survival follows a brutal rhythm. The green-skinned wardens don't just imprison their enemies. They turn captivity into entertainment. Marcus pressed his back against the rusted metal wall, listening to the crowd's roar echo through the compound. The smell of blood and engine oil hung thick in the recycled air. His stomach cramped with hunger, a constant companion for the past 3 weeks. The Orks had discovered something delicious about human desperation. Every morning, the loudspeakers crackled to life with guttural Ork laughter. "Fight time, puny Yumis." The voice belonged to War Boss Scarfang, the camp's commander who treated human suffering like a personal hobby. Prisoners were dragged from their cells in groups of 20. The lucky ones got assigned to the feeding pits, cramped spaces where they fought over scraps of questionable meat and fungus beer. The unlucky ones faced the combat arenas. Marcus watched through the barred window as Sarah, a former Imperial Guard sergeant, was shoved into the central pit. Her opponent, a malnourished factory worker who could barely stand. The Orks didn't care about fair fights. They cared about spectacle. Make it good or no food. Scarfang bellowed from his throne of welded scrap metal and human skulls. Sarah's hands trembled as she picked up the rusted pipe they'd thrown into the arena. The factory worker grabbed a broken bottle. Neither wanted to fight. Both knew the alternative. Starvation was a slower death than violence. The crowd of Ork guards pressed against the barriers, their yellow eyes gleaming with anticipation. They bet on everything: who would strike first, how long the fight would last, whether the loser would beg. Marcus had learned the feeding schedule by heart. Winners ate first, actual protein rations and clean water. Second place got the scraps. Everyone else waited until tomorrow, if they were lucky. The arena fell silent as Sarah raised her weapon. Then she did something that made even the Orks stop laughing. Instead of attacking the factory worker, she turned toward Scarfang's throne. Her voice cut through the sudden quiet like a blade through flesh. "You want a real fight? Come down here yourself, coward." The temperature in the compound seemed to drop 10 degrees. Scarfang's massive frame slowly rose from his throne, his tusks gleaming in the artificial light. But what happened next would change everything Marcus thought he knew about Ork psychology. The screaming echoes differently depending on the throat it tears from. In the deepest pits of Scarjaw's prison asteroid, Captain Vexhai watched a Tau fire warrior collapse against rusted bars. The blue-skinned alien's precise military training meant nothing here. His Tauva philosophy of the greater good crumbled like ash in his trembling hands. "Water. Please," the Tau whispered in broken Gothic. The Orks had learned something terrifying about cross-species psychology. Each race broke differently under their crude justice system. Humans lasted longest through pure, stubborn hatred. Their imperial conditioning taught them to endure suffering as duty. But even space marines eventually snapped when forced to watch civilians die for their defiance. Eldar prisoners moved like ghosts, their psychic abilities dulled by crude psi dampeners welded to their skulls. The elegant warriors who once danced through battle now stumbled blind, their foresight stolen. Without their precognitive gifts, they became fragile as porcelain. The smell of fear varied too. Human sweat carried notes of iron and desperation. Tau pheromones shifted to acrid panic. Eldar terror smelled like dying flowers. But the Orks? They found this fascinating. Boss Scarjaw would lumber through the cells each morning, studying his collection like a grotesque scientist. He'd poke at prisoners with his power claw, testing their reactions. This one still got fight. He'd bellow at a snarling human. This one just whimpers. He'd laugh at a broken Tau. The green-skinned warden had discovered that mixing species in cells created beautiful chaos. Humans would try to protect weaker aliens out of misplaced nobility. Tau would attempt to organize escape plans with mathematical precision. Eldar would retreat into catatonic meditation. Each response fed the Orcs' sadistic entertainment differently. Vexhai pressed his face against the cold metal bars, watching a human sergeant share his meager water ration with a dying Eldar ranger. The act of compassion seemed absurd in this place of orchestrated cruelty. The temperature dropped as night cycle approached. In the darkness, prayers rose in a dozen languages. Imperial hymns mixed with Tau mantras and Eldar death songs. Scarjaw's laughter boomed through the corridors. Tomorrow we try something new. His voice echoed off blood-stained walls. The Orc guards began dragging specific prisoners from their cells. One from each species, always one from each species. Vexhai's blood turned to ice as heavy footsteps approached his door. But what Scarjaw had planned for his multi-species experiment would make everything before seem like mercy. The screaming echoes through Gork's Hammer Penitentiary as another rehabilitation session begins. Boss Scarjaw believes in improvement. His methods would make Imperial torturers weep. Fix Dahumi, he bellows, pointing at Captain Thorne strapped to a crude metal chair. Make him more orky. The rehabilitation chamber reeks of motor oil and burnt flesh. Rusted surgical tools hang from chains, their edges stained with the blood of previous patients. Doc Gutripper approaches with his favorite instrument, a bone saw retrofitted with a chainsaw motor. The blade screams to life, drowning out Thorne's protests. This won't hurt. Much. Gutripper grins, yellow tusks gleaming. Orc rehabilitation follows simple logic. If prisoners aren't green and violent enough, they need fixing. The process involves crude cybernetic implants, forced steroid injections, and surgical modifications that would horrify even Dark Eldar. Thorne watches in horror as Gutripper selects a syringe filled with luminescent green fluid. The Orc medicine bubbles and hisses, eating through the metal needle. This make you strong like Orc. Gutripper cackles, jabbing the needle into Thorne's arm. Fire courses through the captain's veins. His muscles spasm violently as alien chemicals rewrite his biology. His skin begins to take on a sickly green pallor. But physical transformation is only the beginning. Orcs believe proper rehabilitation requires attitude adjustment. They force prisoners to participate in gladiatorial combat, pitting humans against each other for Orc entertainment. Fight or we make you into squig food. Guards roar, prodding weakened prisoners into the arena. The sand beneath their feet is black with dried blood. Makeshift weapons litter the ground. Rusted pipes, broken bottles, chains torn from cell walls. Survivors receive rewards, extra gruel, slightly cleaner cells, or the privilege of cleaning Orc weapons. These small mercies become precious beyond measure. Thorn's fellow prisoners show varying stages of rehabilitation. Some have grown crude tusks. Others sport cybernetic limbs that spark and malfunction. A few have developed the characteristic orc slouch and aggressive posture. The most successful cases join orc warbands as auxiliary fighters. They retain enough human cunning to be useful, but their minds have been broken and rebuilt in the orc image. Soon, you be good, orc. Scarjaw laughs, watching Thorn convulse from the injections. Den we find you nice warband to join. The green fluid reaches Thorn's brain. His vision blurs as foreign thoughts begin to intrude. Violent urges, the desire to fight, to destroy, to prove his strength through brutality. He tries to resist, clinging to memories of his former life. But the chemical tide is relentless. As consciousness fades, Thorn hears Gutripper preparing the next syringe. But what they injected next would change everything. The screaming stopped at dawn. Warboss Scarjaw stood over the twisted remains of what had once been his most violent prisoners. The scrapyard stretched before him like a graveyard of metal and bone. "This is where the really bad boys go," he growled to his lieutenant. The stench of rust and blood hung thick in the morning air. The rehabilitation program wasn't about making orcs better. It was about making them useful. Chained to massive scrap heaps, the worst offenders were forced to sort through mountains of twisted metal. Their green skin bore the scars of countless cuts from razor-sharp debris. Each piece they touched could slice through bone. But that wasn't the real torture. The orcs were builders by nature, warriors who lived to create weapons of war. Here, they were forbidden from making anything that could kill. Spoons, bowls, crude cooking pots. Their massive hands, designed for gripping axes and shutas, fumbled with delicate metalwork. The psychological torment was exquisite. Grukfung had been here for 3 months. Once a mighty knob who commanded 100 warriors, now he bent scrap metal into dinner plates. His tusks had been filed down to nubs. His spirit, once unbreakable, cracked a little more each day. "Please," he whispered to the overseer, "let me make just one choppa. Just one." The overseer's whip cracked across his back. "Back to work, you get." The temperature in the yard could reach 120 degrees. The metal burned their hands. The sun baked their skulls. But they couldn't stop working. Because the real horror of the scrap yard wasn't the heat or the cuts or the humiliation. It was what happened to orcs who refused to work. Scarjaw led his guest to a special section of the yard. Here, dozens of orcs stood perfectly still, their eyes vacant and staring. They breathed. They blinked. But they no longer moved. "We call them the stairs," Scarjaw explained with pride. "They wouldn't make the spoons, so we made them into something else." The lobotomies were crude but effective. A simple drill through the skull, a few strategic cuts to the brain. The orcs retained just enough consciousness to suffer, but not enough to resist. They would stand there forever, watching their brothers work. A living reminder of what happened to those who defied the system. But as Scarjaw turned to leave, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. One of the stairs was smiling, and in his motionless hand, he clutched a perfectly crafted shiv. The iron cage hung suspended above the central fire pit. Inside, Scarfang the betrayer clawed at rusted bars that burned his flesh with each touch. The metal had been blessed by mech boys with pain-inducing currents. This was orc justice, brutal, personal, unforgettable. Wah! The crowd below roared their approval as Scarfang's screams echoed across the camp. But this wasn't entertainment. This was education. Orks don't build prisons like humans do. No concrete cells, no rehabilitation programs. When an Ork betrays the Wa, when he steals from his own kind or shows cowardice in battle, the punishment becomes spectacle. Scarfang had committed the ultimate sin. He'd fled during a charge, leaving his boys to die. Now every Ork in the warband would witness his suffering. The cage swayed in the acrid smoke. Below, younger Orks pressed closer, their red eyes reflecting the flames. They needed to see. They needed to understand. Betray the Wak, and the Wak betrays you back. Please, boss. Scarfang wheezed, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. I'll fight better next time. I swear on Gork and Mork. Warboss Grimskull didn't even look up from sharpening his choppa. The blade sang against the whetstone, a rhythmic scraping that somehow sounded like laughter. Next time? Grimskull's voice rumbled like distant thunder. Ain't gonna be no next time for cowards. The cage began to lower, inch by agonizing inch. Scarfang's eyes widened as the heat intensified. The metal bars glowed cherry red now, searing his palms as he gripped them. The smell of burning flesh mixed with smoke and sweat. But here's what makes Ork prison different from any human concept of justice. It's not about punishment. It's about purification through pain. The Orks believe that suffering burns away weakness. That agony forges strength. If Scarfang survived the cage, if he endured the fire and the shame, he might earn his place back in the warband. If he died screaming, well, that proved he was weak all along. The cage dropped another foot. Scarfang's boots began to smoke. Around the fire, 100 Ork voices started chanting. Not words of mockery, but something older, something primal. They were singing him into the flames. But as the cage reached its lowest point, something unexpected happened. Scarfang stopped screaming. He started laughing. The sound sent chills through even the hardest Ork veterans. Because they recognized that laugh. It was the sound of an Ork finding his rage again. Grok pressed his scarred face against the rusted bars, watching the endless parade of Ork guards shuffle past his cell. The metal felt cold against his tusks, a constant reminder of 23 failed escape attempts. In human prisons, inmates dream of freedom. They count days, dig tunnels, forge alliances, but this is an Ork prison. The irony cuts deeper than any shiv. Grok had been the most cunning knob in his war band, capable of outsmarting Imperial tacticians and Eldar rangers alike. Now he couldn't even convince his own species that escape was possible. Oi, Grok, bellowed Scarfang from the neighboring cell. Tell us again about that time you almost got out. The other prisoners erupted in their familiar chorus of grunts and snorts. They'd heard this story hundreds of times. But Orks never tired of a good tale, especially one about glorious failure. Grok's voice carried the weight of defeat. It was during Da Food riot last winter. Guards were distracted, beating up the kitchen crew for putting too much squig grease into stew. He remembered the taste of hope, metallic and sharp, like blood on his tongue. The corridor had stretched before him, empty for the first time in months. Freedom lay just 50 meters away. I made it to Da outer wall, Grok continued, his massive hands gripping the bars until his knuckles went white. Could smell Da outside air. Proper Ork air, full of smoke and gunpowder. The listening prisoners leaned closer, their eyes reflecting the dim emergency lighting that never seemed to work properly. Even after hearing this story countless times, they hung on every word. But then what happened? Prompted Scarfang, though he knew the answer by heart. Grok's shoulders sagged. I stopped. Just stopped. Stood there like a grot with its head cut off. The silence that followed was heavier than the prison's reinforced walls. Every orc in that block understood the crushing truth. They weren't built for escape. Their genetics, their culture, their very souls were hardwired for conflict, not cunning. Breaking out required patience, planning, subtlety. 3 concepts that might as well have been written in ancient Eldar script. Maybe tomorrow, whispered Grok, the same lie he'd told himself for 3 years. But as the lights dimmed for another sleepless night, a new sound echoed through the prison corridors, something that made every orc's blood run cold. The sound of Imperial boots, marching in perfect formation, and they were getting closer. The stench of dried blood mixed with fungal spores creates an atmosphere thick enough to choke on. In the deepest levels of orc prison ships, where rust weeps from bulkheads like tears, the strongest prisoners face their final test. Graduation Day. Cragnock the Bloodfist watches from his throne of welded scrap metal. His scarred green hide bears the marks of 1,000 fights. Today, he decides who lives free and who dies screaming. The blood pits stretch before him like ancient coliseums. Circular arenas carved from ship hulls, their floors stained black with decades of violence. The air vibrates with the roar of 10,000 orc voices. Wah! 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 Below, 3 prisoners stand in chains. Each has survived months in the cramped cells. Each has proven their worth through daily combat. But only one will walk out alive. The first prisoner, a massive knob called Scarjaw, flexes muscles like steel cables. His tusks gleam yellow in the flickering torchlight. He's killed 17 inmates with his bare hands. The second, a scarred veteran named Grok, clutches a rusted blade. His left eye socket weeps constantly from an old wound. He whispers prayers to Gork and Mork. The third prisoner makes the crowd fall silent. It's not an orc. The human stands barely half their height. His Imperial Guard uniform hangs in tatters. Burn scars cover his arms like twisted rope. How did he survive this long in an orc prison? Cragnock leans forward. His voice booms across the arena like thunder. Today, one of you earns freedom. The others feed the squigs. The chains fall away with metallic crashes that echo through the ship. 3 fighters circle each other in the blood-soaked sand. The human's breathing comes in short, sharp gasps. Then Scarjaw charges. His war cry splits the air as he swings a massive fist toward the human skull. But the smaller fighter moves like liquid mercury, sliding beneath the blow. A blade flashes. Scarjaw stumbles, green blood spurting from his throat. He crashes to the arena floor with a sound like falling timber. The crowd erupts in shocked silence. Grok stares at the human in disbelief. 30 seconds. This tiny creature has killed their strongest fighter. But as the human turns toward his final opponent, Cragnock notices something that makes his blood run cold. The scars on the human's arms aren't from burns. They're orc bite marks, and they're fresh. The smell of roasting meat drifts through the iron corridors of Grokfang's prison complex. But this isn't Grok's. This isn't Squig. Warden Scarjaw sits at his crude throne, gnawing on a femur still warm from the fire. The bone cracks between his massive jaws, marrow oozing down his scarred chin. Justice! He grunts to his assembled guards. Tastes like chicken. The other orcs roar with laughter. They don't understand the irony. In orc society, eating your enemies is the highest honor you can give them. But Scarjaw has twisted this sacred tradition into something darker. He doesn't just eat defeated foes, he eats the prisoners the ones who break the unbreakable rules, the ones who show weakness, the ones who beg. Bring me the next course, Scarjaw bellows. Two guards drag in Grimdark, a former nob who dared question the warden's authority. His eyes are wide with terror, but also confusion. Boss, Grimdark stammers. I fought beside you at Armageddon. I saved your life when the Humies... That was before you went soft. Scarjaw interrupts, wiping grease from his tusks. The temperature in the chamber drops. Even the other guards shift uncomfortably. This isn't about justice anymore. This is about fear. Scarjaw stands, his massive frame casting shadows across the feast table. You know what the worst crime is in my prison? Grimdark shakes his head, remembering who I used to be. The cleaver falls with a wet thud. But as Scarjaw raises the blade for the killing blow, something unexpected happens. Grimdark doesn't flinch. Instead, he smiles. You think eating me makes you strong? Grimdark laughs, blood frothing from his lips. You're just hungry because you're empty inside. The words hit harder than any weapon. Scarjaw freezes. Around the chamber, guards exchange glances. They've never seen their warden hesitate. I ain't empty, Scarjaw snarls, but his voice wavers. Then why do you keep feeding? The question hangs in the air like smoke from the cooking fires. For the first time in decades, Scarjaw looks at his hands. Really looks at them. They're stained with the blood of hundreds of prisoners. Orks who trusted him. Orks who followed him. Orks who called him friend. The cleaver trembles in his grip, but the real horror hadn't even begun. The scream echoes through the rusted corridors as war boss Scarjaw's boot connects with a grot's skull. This is how order works in Ork prisons. Not through laws, not through rehabilitation, through the ancient hierarchy of violence that has governed greenskin society for millennia. At the top sits the war boss, the biggest, meanest orc who earned his position by crushing every challenger. His cell isn't a cell at all. It's a throne room carved from scrap metal and decorated with the teeth of his enemies. Scarjaw runs this particular hellhole with iron fists and rusted chains. Every morning, he selects 3 prisoners for his morning exercises. Brutal beatings that remind everyone who rules here. The metallic taste of fear hangs in the recycled air. Below him, the knobs enforce his will. These scarred veterans patrol the cell blocks, their heavy boots creating a rhythmic thunder that makes smaller orcs press against cold concrete walls. They collect tribute, extra rations, improvised weapons, anything shiny that catches their eye. Refuse to pay, and you become tomorrow's entertainment in the fighting pits. The stench of unwashed bodies and spilled blood grows stronger as you descend the hierarchy. Regular boys form the middle tier. They survive by forming crude gangs, sharing resources, and picking on those weaker than themselves. Their knuckles are permanently split from constant brawling. At the bottom crawl the grots, small, pathetic creatures who serve as slaves, punching bags, and occasionally food when rations run low. But here's what makes Ork prison truly terrifying. This isn't chaos. This is their version of civilization. Every beating serves a purpose. Every humiliation reinforces the natural order. The strongest lead, the weak serve, and everyone knows exactly where they stand. The guards rarely intervene. Why would they? The Orks police themselves more efficiently than any human system could manage. When ites break out, and they break out hourly, the hierarchy sorts itself through blood and broken bones. Winners climb higher. Losers learn their place or die trying to change it. The temperature drops as night falls, but the violence never sleeps. Scarjaw's laughter booms through the darkness as he watches two boys tear each other apart over a moldy piece of bread. This is his kingdom. This is his justice. But even war bosses aren't immortal. And in the shadows of Block 7, something is stirring. Something that might just be big enough to challenge the hierarchy itself. The question isn't whether Scarjaw's reign will end. The question is who will be strong enough to take his place. The stench of blood and motor oil fills the fighting pit as two massive orcs circle each other in the dim red light. This isn't entertainment. This is therapy. In the twisted logic of orc society, violence isn't just permitted in their prisons, it's prescribed. The wardens, themselves scarred veterans of countless battles, understand something that would horrify any human observer. Orcs don't just crave violence. They need it to survive. Crump. "I'm good," bellows war boss Scarjaw from his elevated throne, watching as two inmates tear into each other with makeshift weapons. His single remaining eye gleams with something approaching medical interest. The larger orc, nicknamed Smasher by the guards, drives his opponent into the razor wire walls. The crowd of prisoners roars approval, their own hands twitching for combat. But this isn't mindless brutality. Every fight serves a purpose. The weaker orc, the one who killed his own squad leader in a moment of cowardice, must prove he's remembered what it means to be orc. The stronger one, imprisoned for showing mercy to human prisoners, needs to rediscover his killer instinct. The pit floor, slick with generations of spilled blood, bears witness to this grotesque form of rehabilitation. Teeth and bone fragments crunch underfoot as the combatants grapple. Smasher's massive fist connects with a wet thud. His opponent staggers, green blood streaming from a split lip. The crowd falls silent. In human prisons, violence is punished. Here, it's the cure. Orcs who refuse to fight are force-fed fungus beer until they're sick enough to want death. Those who fight but show restraint face even worse fates. The temperature drops as evening approaches, but the fighters' bodies steam with exertion and rage. Their breathing creates clouds in the cold air as they circle again. War boss Scarjaw leans forward, studying the combatants like a surgeon examining a patient. He's seen thousands of these fights. He knows the signs. The weaker orc's eyes are changing. The dull shame that marked him as unorky is burning away, replaced by the familiar red haze of proper orc fury. Redemption through violence, salvation through brutality. The crowd begins to chant as both fighters raise their weapons for the final exchange. This is the moment that will determine not just who wins, but who remembers what they truly are. The sound of metal on bone echoes through the pit. But what happened next would reveal the true horror of orc justice. The smell hits you first. Rotting fungus mixed with spilled blood and the acrid stench of crude orc weaponry in the deepest levels of Prison Complex Gork 7, something unprecedented was happening. Imperial guards, captured during the siege of Mordian VII, found themselves face to face with rival orc clans in the same detention blocks. Sergeant Marcus Vex pressed his back against the rusted metal wall. The temperature down here never rose above freezing. His breath came in visible puffs as he watched the chaos unfold. 20 meters away, the Bad Moons clan was tearing into the Goff prisoners with crude choppas. Green blood splattered across corrugated iron walls like abstract art painted in violence. The Orks had turned their own prison into a gladiatorial nightmare. "They're using us as entertainment," whispered Private Chen, her voice barely audible over the guttural roars echoing through the corridors. But Marcus had noticed something else. something that made his skin crawl with a different kind of terror. The Ork guards weren't stopping the fights. They were betting on them. Massive knob wardens stood in elevated positions, throwing crude metal tokens into buckets. Their tusked faces split into horrifying grins as Imperial soldiers were dragged into the fighting pits. The irony was suffocating. Humanity's elite warriors, trained to kill Xenos, now served as gambling chips in an alien prison economy. A Goth Ork, easily 3 meters tall, grabbed Private Chen by her uniform collar. The fabric tore with a sharp, ripping sound that cut through the ambient chaos. Marcus felt his heart hammering against his ribs. The metal floor beneath his boots vibrated with the thunderous footsteps of approaching wardens. This wasn't just imprisonment. This was systematic dehumanization wrapped in Ork brutality. The rival clans had discovered that Imperial guards made excellent practice dummies for settling inter-clan disputes. Fresh meat that screamed in interesting ways when torn apart. Chen's terrified eyes met Marcus's across the blood-slicked floor. She mouthed a single word: run. But there was nowhere to go. The Orks had learned something from their Imperial captives. Psychological warfare. They weren't just breaking bodies. They were breaking spirits. The temperature seemed to drop another degree as massive blast doors began grinding shut. The sound was like metal bones breaking. Marcus realized with crystalline horror that the real entertainment was just beginning. But what happened next would redefine everything he thought he knew about Ork cruelty. The Mech Boy's workshop stretches across 3 city blocks of twisted metal and grinding gears. Here, in the deepest pit of Ork society, the worst offenders face their final judgment, not death. Something worse. Redemption through creation. Gazkul Maguruk, Thraka himself designed this punishment after watching a particularly cowardly Ork flee from battle. The stench of motor oil and burning rubber fills the air as massive hydraulic presses slam down every few seconds, shaking the ground beneath bare feet. The condemned Orks stand chained to workbenches, their massive hands forced to craft the very weapons that will arm their former enemies. Each rivet they hammer drives deeper shame into their souls. Each bolt they tighten reminds them of their cowardice. The irony cuts deeper than any blade. These warriors who failed in battle must now perfect the art of war through endless labor. Overseer Mech Scarjaw watches from his elevated platform, his mechanical eye whirring as it focuses on each prisoner. The temperature rises to unbearable levels as furnaces roar to life, melting scrap metal into new instruments of destruction. Sweat pours down green skin, mixing with motor oil to create dark rivulets that pool on the concrete floor. Build it right, or build it again. Scarjaw growls through his Vox grill. The sound of hammers on anvils creates a rhythmic thunder that never stops, day or night. Some prisoners have been here for decades, their hands permanently stained black with grease, their minds broken by the endless repetition. But something else happens in this mechanical hell. Slowly, methodically, the worst of Ork society begins to understand the beauty of creation over destruction. Their crude weapons become works of art. Their shoddy repairs transform into masterpieces of engineering. The shame that brought them here gradually transforms into pride, not in battle, but in craftsmanship. The most dangerous realization comes when they understand the truth. They're not just building weapons. They're building the future of the Ork Empire. One perfect bolt at a time, and some of them never want to leave. The workshop falls silent as Scarjaw's mechanical eye fixes on a particular workstation. The prisoner there has just completed something that shouldn't be possible. A weapon so perfect, so beautiful, that even the mech boy feels his breath catch. But when he looks closer at the craftsman's face, Scarjaw sees something that chills him to his metal bones. The prisoner is smiling. The stench of fear mingles with engine grease as guardsman Keller presses his back against the rusted wall. His fingers trace the crude tunnel he's carved over 17 days. Each scrape of metal against metal echoed through the scrap-built cells like a death knell. But Keller isn't the first to try. The Orks have turned escape attempts into entertainment. They call it Dog Rate Hunt. Every failed escapee becomes prey in their twisted game of cat and mouse. Keller remembers the screams of Lieutenant Voss 3 weeks ago. The man had made it 40 meters beyond the perimeter before the hunting squigs found him. The Orks dragged what remained back to the prison yard. They hung the pieces from the watchtowers as decoration. "This is what happens when you try to leg it," Boss Scarjaw had bellowed, his mechanical jaw clicking with each word. The other prisoners had watched in silence. Some wept, others simply stared at the ground. But Keller noticed something else that day. The Orks weren't just punishing Voss. They were studying him. Every escape attempt teaches them something new about human desperation, about breaking points, about how far flesh can bend before it snaps. Now, as Keller prepares to crawl through his tunnel, he feels the weight of that knowledge. The Orks know he's here. They've known for days. The tunnel he's carved so carefully, it leads exactly where they want it to lead. Into the fighting pits. Keller's breath catches as the truth hits him. The loose rivets he found, the conveniently placed tools, the guard rotations that seemed perfectly timed. None of it was luck. It was orchestration. The Orks don't just punish escape attempts. They manufacture them. Every tunnel leads to the same place. Every successful breakout ends in the same arena where desperate humans fight for Ork amusement. The prisoners who escape become gladiators. Those who refuse to fight become target practice. Keller's hands shake as he realizes the horrible truth. There is no escape from an Ork prison. There are only different forms of entertainment. Behind him, heavy footsteps echo through the corridor. Guttural laughter bounces off the metal walls. "Found another one, boss," a voice calls out. Keller closes his eyes and crawls forward into the tunnel. But as he moves through the darkness, he hears something that stops his blood cold. The sound of betting. The Orks are wagering on how long he'll last in the pits. And from the numbers being thrown around, they don't expect him to survive the first fight. In the sprawling scrap cities of Ork society, one figure towers above the rest in the prison hierarchy: the warden. But how does an Ork become the ultimate authority over thousands of imprisoned greenskins? The answer lies in the brutal meritocracy that governs every aspect of Ork culture. Boss Scarjaw didn't start as warden of Sludge Pit Prison. He began as just another knob, thrown into the facility after losing a particularly spectacular clan war. The metallic clang of his chains echoed through the corridors as guards dragged his massive frame past jeering inmates. The smell of rust and decay filled his nostrils. But where others saw defeat, Scarjaw saw opportunity. Within hours of his arrival, he'd already identified the prison's power structure. The current warden was old, slow, growing soft from years of comfortable authority. His scarred hands trembled slightly when he spoke. Scarjaw began small, a few strategic fights in the exercise yards. Each victory drew more attention, more followers. The concrete beneath his boots grew slick with the blood of challengers who thought they could claim his growing reputation. The turning point came during a massive riot in Block 7, While other inmates fought chaotically, Scarjaw organized. He turned the rebellion into a tactical demonstration, proving he could command not just through violence, but through cunning. The old warden watched from his tower, sweat beading on his weathered brow despite the cold air. He knew what was coming. Orcish law is simple. The strongest leads. When Scarjaw finally challenged the warden directly, half the prison gathered to watch. The fight lasted 3 brutal hours, echoing through every cell block like thunder. The old warden's final scream still haunts the ventilation shafts. But Scarjaw's rise revealed something darker about Orc prison culture. The position of warden isn't just about maintaining order. It's about orchestrating the perfect balance of chaos and control. Too much peace, and the inmates grow restless. Too much violence, and productivity suffers. Scarjaw learned to read the temperature of his domain like a master chef tasting soup. A fight here, an execution there, always keeping the population on edge, but never quite in open revolt. His office, carved from a massive shipping container, overlooks the entire facility. The walls are decorated with the skulls of previous wardens, a reminder that power in Orc society is always temporary. Every morning, he stands at his window, watching thousands of green faces stare back. They're all waiting for their moment, their chance to climb the hierarchy. But what none of them realize is that Scarjaw has been preparing for something much bigger than just running a prison. The stench of rotting flesh had become their constant companion. Captain Thorn pressed his back against the rusted metal wall, feeling the vibrations of Orc machinery grinding somewhere in the darkness above. His uniform hung in tatters, stained with blood that wasn't entirely his own. 3 weeks in this hellhole. 3 weeks since the transport ship had been boarded. The cells stretched 20 meters in each direction, a converted cargo hold that now housed 47 Imperial Guard survivors. The floor was slick with moisture that dripped from corroded pipes overhead, water mixed with something far worse. "They're coming again," whispered Sergeant Hayes, her voice barely audible over the distant roar of Orc war chants. The sound of heavy boots echoed through the corridor. Metal scraped against metal as the massive door began to slide open, flooding their prison with harsh yellow light. Thorn watched his soldiers shrink back into the shadows. Some had already broken. Private Morrison rocked back and forth, muttering prayers to the Emperor. Corporal Vex stared at the wall with empty eyes, his mind shattered after witnessing what the Orcs did to their medic. The temperature dropped as cold air rushed in from the corridor. 2 massive Orcs filled the doorway, their tusks gleaming in the artificial light. Behind them stood something worse, a human collaborator wearing the torn remnants of an Imperial Navy uniform. "Fresh meat for the boss," growled the larger Orc, pointing a crude finger at 3 soldiers huddled near the back wall. Thorn felt his jaw clench. Every day, they took 3. Every day, those 3 never returned. The collaborator's eyes met Thorn's across the cell. There was no humanity left in that gaze, only the hollow satisfaction of survival at any price. "You," the traitor pointed directly at Thorn, "and the 2 beside you." The captain's hand instinctively reached for a weapon that wasn't there. His fingers found only empty air and the bitter taste of helplessness. Around him, his remaining soldiers watched in silence. Some had tears streaming down their faces. Others had already turned away, unable to witness another selection. Thorn stood slowly, his knees protesting after hours crouched on the cold metal floor. The Orcs grinned, revealing rows of yellowed teeth. But as he stepped forward, something caught his eye in the shadows behind the guards. A familiar silhouette moved in the corridor beyond. Someone who shouldn't be alive. The stench hits you first, rotting meat, spilled grog, the metallic tang of fresh blood. Boss Scarjaw's feast hall stretches before the assembled prisoners like a vision from the deepest pit of hell. Crude tables fashioned from scrap metal groan under the weight of unidentifiable flesh. Ork guards brandish rusty clubs, their yellow eyes gleaming with sadistic anticipation. This isn't just dinner. This is judgment. Wah! Time for the feast! Scarjaw's voice booms across the chamber, echoing off walls stained with decades of violence. His massive frame towers over a throne built from the bones of previous inmates. Da strong eats first. Da weak. Well, day becomes da food. The temperature drops. Even hardened criminals feel their stomachs clench. Prisoners shuffle forward in chains, their bare feet slipping on floors slick with grease and worse. The smart ones learned long ago. Hesitation means death. The weak are already being dragged toward massive cooking pots that bubble with suspicious enthusiasm. Scarjaw raises a gnarled fist. See that Humi over there? He points to a trembling Imperial Guard deserter. Yesterday, he tried to escape. Today, he's the main course. The prisoner's screams echo as Ork cooks seize him. But this isn't random cruelty. It's calculated terror. Every bite, every scream, every drop of blood serves Scarjaw's twisted sense of order. The strongest prisoners feast on mystery meat, while the weak gnaw scraps. Hierarchy written in hunger, power measured in portions. This is how he keeps order, Scarjaw explains to a visiting mech, his voice casual as inmates fight over bones. Fear keeps him in line, but fear mixed with hunger? That makes him desperate enough to be useful. The mech nods approvingly. Smart thinking, boss. But Scarjaw's yellow eyes glint with something darker than mere pragmatism. He enjoys this. The screams, the desperation, the absolute power over life and death. A new prisoner stumbles into the hall, fresh meat, literally and figuratively, young, terrified, still believing rescue might come. Scarjaw's grin widens, revealing teeth like rusted daggers. Welcome to Da Feast, Humi. Hope you brought an appetite. The crowd of inmates turns toward the newcomer with predatory hunger. Some lick their lips, others grip makeshift weapons. But what they saw next would haunt even these hardened survivors. The screaming starts before dawn. Inside the ramshackle cages that pass for Ork prisons, captured humans huddle against rusted metal bars. The stench of unwashed bodies mingles with the acrid smoke from crude furnaces. But this isn't just imprisonment. This is entertainment. Way! Time for the fights! The Ork warden's bellow echoes through the detention blocks. His massive frame casts shadows across trembling prisoners as he drags a chain behind him. The fighting pits stretch before them like open wounds in the earth. Crude amphitheaters carved from scrap metal and bone, where Orks gather to watch their captives tear each other apart. For the prisoners, there's no choice. Fight or become tomorrow's rations. Sergeant Collins feels his hands shake as the gate creaks open. 3 weeks in this hellhole, and he's watched good soldiers become animals. The cold metal of makeshift weapons burns against his palms. Across the pit, another human prisoner emerges. A woman, barely 20, clutching a sharpened piece of rebar. Her eyes hold the same desperate hunger Collins recognizes in his own reflection. The Ork crowd roars approval, their guttural cheers drowning out everything else. Green fists pound against metal barriers as they place bets on which human will survive. Kill! 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 The chant builds like thunder. Collins knows the rules. Winner gets an extra ration of fungus bread. Loser feeds the squigs. But there's an unspoken truth that cuts deeper than any blade. Every fight strips away another piece of who they used to be. The woman circles him, her breathing sharp and quick. Sweat drips down her face despite the bitter cold. Collins sees the calculation in her eyes, the same math he's running. One of them walks out. One of them doesn't. The Orc warden drops his massive hand, signaling the start. The crowd's bloodlust reaches fever pitch as both humans raise their weapons. But in that moment, before violence erupts, Collins catches something in the woman's expression. A flicker of recognition. A shared understanding of what they've both lost. What they're still losing. The first strike comes faster than expected, and Collins realizes with growing horror that survival in Orc detention doesn't just mean staying alive. It means forgetting you were ever human at all. But what happens when even that last shred of humanity becomes a weapon? The stench of rusted metal and spilled blood marks every promotion in Orc society. In the sprawling detention blocks of Orc space hulks, yesterday's prisoner becomes tomorrow's warden through the simplest currency of all violence. Grok had been chained to the wall for 3 rotations, his green skin bearing the burn marks of shock prods and the bite of iron shackles. The taste of his own blood had become familiar, metallic and warm against his split lips. But when the current boss warden made the mistake of turning his back during feeding time, Grok's massive fists found their target. The wet crack of vertebrae echoed through the detention block like a gunshot. Within minutes, Grok wore the warden's crude insignia, a necklace of filed teeth and scrap metal that still dripped with its previous owner's blood. The other prisoners roared their approval, fists pounding against cell walls in a thunderous rhythm. This is the Orc way. No applications, no interviews, no gradual promotion through ranks. Just the ancient law that might makes right, written in bone and sinew. The newly crowned Warden Grok's first act was to release his former cellmates, not from mercy but from practicality. He needed enforcers, and who better than those who had shared his pain? The irony cuts deep. Yesterday's victim becomes today's oppressor with the speed of a falling axe. Grok now walks the same corridors where he once crawled, bleeding. His boots, stolen from his predecessor's corpse, leave bloody prints on the same metal grating where his own blood had pooled just hours before. The cycle spins endlessly. Power changes hands with each act of brutality, each moment of weakness exploited. In human prisons, we speak of rehabilitation, of second chances, of justice served and debts paid to society. But what happens when the society itself is built on the principle that suffering is currency? When the only path to freedom runs through the broken bodies of those who came before? Grok's story plays out in corporate boardrooms and political chambers across our own world every day. The prisoner becomes the warden. The oppressed becomes the oppressor. The only difference is the honesty of the violence. In the end, perhaps we're all just waiting for our turn to hold the keys, or to have them ripped from our dying hands. Every hierarchy is a prison. Every promotion, a changing of the guard. Subscribe if you dare to see who's really holding your chains. The final truth cuts deeper than any chopper blade. Or perhaps there is no final truth at all. Because here's what the Imperium scholars refuse to record in their sacred texts. Here's what the Tau refuse to acknowledge in their greater good manifestos. Here's what even chaos whispers fear to speak aloud. The Orcs don't just survive prison, they transform it. Every cage becomes a forge. Every punishment becomes play. Every attempt at breaking their spirit becomes fuel for the woo that burns eternal in their green hearts. The smell of rusted metal and spilled fungal blood fills recycled air. But underneath that familiar stench lies something else. Something that makes even hardened Imperial interrogators step back from the observation windows. The scent of pure, unbreakable joy. Watch an orc in solitary confinement. See how he pounds rhythms on plasteel walls until his knuckles bleed green. Listen as those rhythms become war chants, as those chants become prayers to Gork and Mork, as prayers become power. The galaxy's greatest minds have tried for 10,000 years to understand this simple horror. How do you break something that finds strength in breaking? How do you punish creatures who turn punishment into sport? The answer whispers through every failed penal colony, through every prison riot that became a celebration, through every execution that became a party. You don't. Because the ultimate punishment isn't what happens to the orcs in prison. It's what happens to everyone else. Every warden who starts laughing at inappropriate moments. Every guard who begins to see the beauty in chaos. Every prisoner who realizes that maybe the greenskins have the right idea about freedom. The infection spreads through steel and stone, through regulations and routine, through the very concept of civilized order itself, until wardens become players in the game, until guards become audience to the show, until the entire prison system becomes just another battlefield where the orcs have already won. The temperature drops as realization sets in, cold metal against warm flesh, the texture of truth against comfortable lies. In our own world, we build prisons to contain the uncontainable. We create punishments for those who refuse to be punished. We maintain order through systems that breed their own chaos. Every cell is a stage. Every sentence, a ticket to the show. So ask yourself this final question as you drift off to sleep tonight. Who's really imprisoned here? Subscribe if you dare to keep watching. Some truths are worth the price of admission.